My name is William Michael. I'm the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Today is Tuesday, August 3rd, and I'd like to take some time to answer a question that I get quite a bit from parents. It's actually very difficult to answer. Difficult to answer in an email or in a phone conversation, but I'd like to take some time today to really get into the details of this issue. And the question is, how does the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's curriculum, how does the curriculum actually lay out? How does it actually work? Is there an order to it? How does the curriculum actually work? And this is actually a very complicated question. Of course, I can provide an answer, but it really requires a good deal of understanding. Because, and this is the key, this is very important, the Classical Liberal Arts Academy curriculum is not like any other school curriculum. Classical Liberal Arts Academy curriculum is not like any other school curriculum. If we were to go and look at the local public school curriculum, if we were to look at a local Catholic school curriculum, if we were to look at any other homeschool curriculum, and it doesn't matter whether it's secular or Christian or Catholic, any public school curriculum, any private Catholic school curriculum, any homeschool curriculum will have one thing in common with all of the others. All of these curricula, all of them, from the public school curriculum to the Catholic homeschool curriculum, all of them are designed to serve the goals of modern education. So what we do, or what these schools do, because I don't do this, but what these schools do is they set the goal for their school or school program. They set the goal at a high school diploma. And the high school diploma is a completely artificial, modern idea. But all of these schools and homeschool programs set their aim at a high school diploma. Colleges operate independently from these K-12 schools. You'll notice there's never a school to be found that starts in kindergarten and offers children a PhD at the end of their studies. No one goes to one school and continues for years and years and years until they finally complete their degree studies. And we might wonder why that is. Why isn't there just one standalone school? Why doesn't Harvard University just start their own preparatory school? Why doesn't Stanford University just cultivate its own students, starting with first grade, and lead them right up through the whole university program to the end, to the highest professional degrees? And the reason is because colleges serve professional ends. And contrary to all of their advertising and claims, they do not make students successful. They have to recruit students from around the country, even around the world, to come to their college already successful. And then they provide successful students with resources and connections in professional fields that allow them to enter into those fields and continue their success. But they all know that it would be a waste of time and money to try and cultivate those students, and so they simply outsource that work to K-12 schools. And K-12 schools, because they have become completely subservient to this secular worldview that considers only professional ends as the ends of the education. K-12 schools have accepted their role as suppliers of applicants to colleges and universities. And then because the schools produced so many students and the elite college and universities left so many students out, inferior colleges and universities developed because there was enough of a supply of students that a business could be created where there was some demand. And so inferior colleges can exist and can make profits because there's so much demand for college studies and an abundance of supplies of students. And so there's this collaboration between K-12 schools and colleges, all of which have as their end, no matter what they say, they can talk about wanting to raise faithful Christians, they can talk about wanting to influence the world for Christ, and that's all false talk. Because what all of these schools and programs have in common is that they exist only to serve the requirements of the colleges and universities above them. Now, once we understand the goal of all of these K-12 programs, we understand that they all start with a box. And that box requires very little actual academic progress. Very little. And because the colleges are interested in adult students who are 18 years and older, the K-12 schools are created to fill those first 18 years and to divide the college admission requirements by 18 years. They take this artificial standard of college admission, divide it by the years through which a child lives as a minor, and they simply break down those admission requirements into 13 or so years of schooling. The schools only meet 180 days a year. Standards are very low. Requirements are very easy to fulfill. And the schools have absolutely no pressure on them to lead students to success because the number of students that the colleges need is actually very small. And if a school has, let's say, 200 students graduating, and 1 or 2 of them are admitted to an elite school, the school can justify the quality of its program by pointing to those 1 or 2 students out of 200 and say, see, our program is sufficient to get a student into an elite school, and everyone else simply didn't make use of the opportunity. And so there's just very little accountability, very little rigor required to meet these requirements. All it takes is 1 or 2 ambitious students with strong, supportive parents who can get admitted into a top school because of his own personal virtue and achievement. And the K-12 school will take credit for that student's achievement and suggest that it's a sign of the quality of the program, even though the other 198 students did not get accepted into an elite college or university. And this is how schools make use of individual student achievement that the school actually isn't responsible for at all. The same thing happens in athletics, where schools receive awards and pennants and banners and championships and trophies that fill the hallways, even though if we look, we find that the school didn't produce those athletes. The school simply used those athletes. Athletes who learned their skills and practiced and developed their skills outside of the school and simply played while they attended the school. And the schools gather all of these awards and credits for things that the schools actually are not responsible for. And this is how modern schooling works, and this is why modern schools are allowed to offer so little and get away with it, because all they need is for one student to succeed, and they can post a video of him receiving a scholarship or being given some honor or trophy, and they publish that as marketing material on the front page of the school website or the homeschool catalog, as if that school is the source or cause of that student's success, which is of course false. So all of these schools, all of the public schools, all of the private schools, all of the homeschool programs, all start as servants of the modern college and university. This artificial system of degrees and certificates and credits and diplomas, completely artificial, unnecessary for most pursuits in life. And yet all of these schools start subject to colleges and universities and aim only at supplying students with what's required for the best of them to be admitted to those colleges and universities. If we step back, we'll find that this system of education has only been around for 100 years or so, and it was never never the model of education used by Catholics throughout church history. This artificial college prep curriculum was never the course of studies pursued by Catholic students, and we're lying to ourselves if we pretend that the vocations crisis isn't owed directly to this sellout among Catholic schools and homeschool programs, which no longer serve the needs of true Catholic education, but which simply serve as nurseries for the colleges and universities. The true ends of Catholic education are no longer served by Catholic schools or by Catholic homeschools. This is why the curriculum of all of these schools, whether it's a public school, a Catholic private school, a Catholic homeschool, if you step back and look at them, they're all exactly the same. They're all just different versions of the same secular, modern curriculum. They're very easy to understand because they're so simple and the goals are so minimal, so low. They're very easy to understand. If your child is 8 years old, you put him in the second grade program. If your child is 12 years old, maybe he goes into the 7th grade program. If you're 15 years old, you go into the 10th grade program. And when you're 18 or 19 years old, if you've simply attended school, you'll get a diploma. You may not get into the colleges, but it doesn't matter because the colleges are businesses and there are a dozen other ways to get into the college if you want to. And that's how this whole modern school culture works. There are never any real standards because there are always other ways, because at the end of the day, the colleges and universities are businesses. And they really don't want to say no to anyone willing to write a tuition check. And that's why all of these curricula, and if you attended a modern grade level school, you'll feel very comfortable with any of these schools because they all have curricula that you'll be familiar with. But none of them have anything to do with historic Catholic education. None of them have anything to do with historic European education. None of them have anything to do with historic Greek or Roman education. None of them have anything to do with historic Jewish education. It's modern education. And the results that it produces are the modern results. When you come to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, you find a completely different culture, a completely different curriculum, completely different goals, completely different courses, completely different standards. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy alone, everything is completely different. Everything is completely different compared to everything that's modern. But if we were to back up 200, 300 years into history, we would find that the modern curricula did not exist. And the Classical Liberal Arts Academy would not only be found similar to what was available in schools, but it would offer far more than any schools did hundreds of years ago, thanks to modern technology and information services. We simply have access to unlimited library resources, which schools in the past could never have matched. And it's also incredibly affordable compared to what school attendance would have cost at different periods of history. Now, we can say that the old Jesuit schools were free, but that simply means that they might have been free to students. But someone always has to pay, and usually it was simply a king or nobles or wealthy parents or some other arrangement that made it possible for schools to be free. But what's offered today in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is unrivaled in history as far as access and affordability are concerned. But what's important to understand is that when you come to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, you should feel like everything is unfamiliar, like everything is different, because it is, and it should be. And that's because we offer a true classical Catholic education. We're not like any other program. We are not accredited by any secular accrediting agency, because it makes no sense that a classical Catholic education would fit the standards of the same accrediting agency that accredits public schools. We're a completely different study program. We're not embarrassed by that. We don't try to eliminate that reality or hide it. We're very proud of it, because modern education has been a colossal disaster. And we're happy to say we're not just another band of people trying to get a cut of the tuition money that's available or the government funding that's available. We're a school program that pursues the true standards of education and does so in a way that's reasonable and true, following the example and counsels of thousands and thousands of history's wisest and best men. The Classical Liberal Arts Academy is completely different from everything else, And so when we look at the Classical Liberal Arts curriculum, we don't find some simple grade level set of books arranged over 12 years of childhood. We find a very complex system of studies. And if we look at this system of studies, it can be quite confusing, because we see that the program starts, for example, with grammar. So young children just getting started begin in the art of grammar, and yet at the same time we find that some of the most difficult lessons in all of learning are found in grammar. In grammar we study the languages, and we all know that languages are among the most difficult studies of all. And yet this is where classical education begins. But it's also where classical education ends. And that's true of every subject in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy curriculum. It appears that education ends in the subjects where it begins. And that will make perfect sense once we think about how learning actually works. Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas explained the means by which we learn, the means by which human beings learn things. First of all, it was taught by the ancient wise men that we never truly understand anything, any subject. We never truly understand any subject until we know its causes. We never understand any subject until we understand the causes of that subject. We could also say we never understand a subject until we know the elements and principles of that subject. And let me give an illustration to make this easy to understand. Imagine if two people entered into a kitchen. One was let's say two 30-year-old men. One was a 30-year-old man who worked in accounting, and the other was a 30-year-old professional chef. So a 30-year-old accountant and a 30-year-old professional chef walk into a kitchen, and on the kitchen is a cake. A cake has been prepared and is set on the table in the kitchen, and a 30-year-old accountant and a 30-year-old professional chef walk into the kitchen and stand in front of this cake. Now, when the accountant looks at the cake, he will see a cake. He'll see a cake, and he'll make a few simple observations about the cake. He may identify what flavor the cake is. He may say, this is a chocolate cake. And he may identify the flavor of the icing on the cake. He may say, this is a chocolate cake with vanilla icing. But that's about all that the accountant will say about the cake. He'll be looking at the cake itself as a whole, and will be able to make a few basic observations about the cake. The chef, on the other hand, will look at the cake, and he'll see the same things that the accountant sees on first glance. He'll also see that this is a chocolate cake with vanilla icing. But the chef, by his experience, will be able to envision the elements from which the cake was made. He'll be able to envision what kind of flour was used, how many eggs were used, what other ingredients were used, how the cake was prepared, he will understand the causes. He'll understand the elements and the principles of the cake. If the cake is flatter than usual, the accountant may look and say, the cake appears a little flat. A simple observation based on his experience with other cakes. If the chef looks at the cake, he will also say, yes, it does look a bit flat, flatter than it should be, but he will also know what causes the cake to be flat, what error may have been made in the preparation of the cake that caused it to be flat, because he'll know the method by which the cake was produced, and he'll know what ingredient or what step was wrongly done or added or omitted that would produce the cake as it is. And so we see that the accountant and the chef would look at the cake, but their knowledge of the cake would be different. One would look at the cake as a whole and make superficial observations about the cake. The other would look at the cake and be able to comment on the elements and causes of the cake. And that's the difference between knowledge and ignorance. That's the difference. And this has to do with how we learn. What it means to learn. And as I said, in general, we know a thing when we know its causes. We know a thing when we know its elements and principles. That's what it means to have expertise or wisdom or prudence or knowledge. It means to know the causes, the elements, principles of any subject. That's the difference between an expert and a novice. Now, this applies to any subject of learning. Any subject of learning. Let's consider another example so we have something to compare. Two people may go to church on a Sunday morning, and there may be a certain priest celebrating the Mass who is scheduled to also give a homily as part of the Mass. And this may be a priest who is widely respected for the quality of his homilies. And so this priest may approach the pulpit when the time for the homily arises, and he may stand and speak for 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And when he finishes, he'll walk away from the pulpit and go back to his chair behind the altar, and everyone will have heard the homily of this priest. And they'll look to one another and say, that was a great homily. But if we were to look in the audience and we were to find one man who, let's say, was a carpenter, and another man who is a rhetorician, one who studies and teaches the art of rhetoric, just as we saw with the cake, they will have similar observations on the superficial level based on their observation. They may both agree, yes, that was a very, very good homily. It was very clear. It was enjoyable. It was pleasant to listen to. It was challenging. I felt stirred to action. It was convicting. I felt that when he talked about sin and our need to amend our lives and abandon sin, I felt moved to repentance. And they can make a few superficial comments about the speech. I should also add that the speaker had a nice voice. He was easy to understand and so on. Simple, superficial observations made by the carpenter and the rhetorician. The rhetorician, however, would be able to go into further detail. And he would be able to say, well, the reason why his voice was pleasant to listen to was because, and he could give specific technical reasons why the speaker's voice was pleasant to listen to. And he could go on and say, the reason why the message was clear is because, and he could give technical explanations of what produced that virtue of clarity in the priest's homily. And he could go on to explain why the audience could feel moved to repentance when the priest spoke about sin. What rhetorical devices the priest used in his homily to move the affections of his hearers. And he could go on and on with technical observations about that homily or speech based on his knowledge of the art of rhetoric. Now, if the carpenter were to turn to the rhetorician and say, can you teach me to speak like this priest? The rhetorician could say, well, there are some elements of his speaking ability that I'm not able to give you, but much of his ability belongs to art, and this I can give you. And the carpenter could begin to study with the rhetorician and learn the art of speaking, the art of oratory. And the carpenter could learn to speak with the same technical qualities that priest did, with some instruction in the art of rhetoric. Likewise, the accountant could learn from the chef the technical skills and knowledge required to make cakes, and he could also gain the knowledge of the art of baking from the chef. And he would begin to share in the knowledge of that art with the chef, just like the carpenter would begin to share in the knowledge of the art with the rhetorician. And over time, if that carpenter had the opportunity to listen to the priest again, the next time he listened to the priest speak, he would observe things that he did not observe the first time because he had gained technical expertise in speaking. He would observe the priest's homily in a way similar, though maybe not as expert as the rhetorician did. Likewise, the accountant, returning and standing before a cake months after his training in baking had begun, would have different views and different observations to make about the cake than he did when he was ignorant of the art in the beginning. And these two illustrations reveal to us the nature of what it means to learn and how learning works. When we're ignorant of any subject, we look, or I should say, we perceive things with our senses. We look at a tree, for example, and we see that it's a certain living thing, it's a plant of some kind, and we can recognize the tall, woody trunk and the broad top with branches and leaves. And any child can point and say, there's a tree, there's a tree. And if we were to point to any tree and say, what is that? The child would say, it's a tree. That's a tree. And that's knowledge based on perception, but it's the knowledge of a novice. It's ignorant familiarity with a thing. The child can see the essential characteristics and name a thing in some general way according to a class to which it belongs. But if that student were to study the science of plants and trees, he would begin to notice all kinds of specific differences between trees. He would begin to notice that the bark of one tree was different from the bark on another tree. He would notice that the size of the trees differ. He would notice that the leaves, their shapes, how the branches are formed. He would notice all different specific differences about the trees. And if he was asked again, what is that? He might not simply say, that's a tree. He might say, that's an oak tree. That's a pin oak tree. That's a white oak tree. That's a red oak tree. That's a pine tree. That's a cedar tree. That's a hickory tree. That's a walnut tree. That's a pecan tree. And he would begin to identify the differences between the trees because his knowledge of the trees would be more expert. Now, what allows this expertise in any subject is the study of the art or science of that subject. This knowledge, the knowledge of an art or science, requires analysis. Analysis is the key to the investigation of any subject. Analysis. And all the word analysis means is to divide something. To divide something. Our initial observations, when we observe things by means of our senses, we perceive things as wholes. We perceive things as wholes. We look at a tree and we see a whole tree, and we see another tree, we recognize it as a whole, and we see and think of wholes. This is the beginning of knowledge, but it would be better to consider this ignorance. A man who does not know a science or art observes things as wholes. The carpenter observed the priest's speech as a whole. The rhetorician analyzed it into technical parts or qualities. The accountant observed the cake as a whole and made some simple observations about the whole, whereas the chef saw the cake as a composition of parts and was able to comment not only on the whole, but also on the parts. Now, it's impossible for anyone to study an art or science until that art or science has been discovered and systematized. It's impossible for anyone to study an art or science until that art or science has been discovered and systematized. Once an art or science has been systematized, then others can study it. But until it's been systematized, it can't be studied, and it can't rightly be called an art or a science. In everyday life, if you turn on a television or watch a video and you see a woman singing beautifully, you may say something like, "Oh my, she is so gifted. She's so gifted." We hear the voice, we hear the quality, we can sense the difficulty of singing or performing with that quality. And taking the voice, taking the performance as a whole, we attribute the excellence of it to talent, to a gift. And we recognize talent. And ignorant people who don't study a particular art or science tend to always assume that those who are skilled at it are simply talented or gifted. And the reason we say this is because it's true that there are some people who are talented or gifted in certain different activities. Throughout history, there have been men who by natural talent have excelled at different skills. Some have been incredibly gifted in music. Some are gifted with a beautiful voice. Some are gifted with an understanding of a certain trade or skill, and they're able to produce things that are far more excellent than any of their peers. And so throughout history, it was always observed that some men excelled others in different activities or skills. And it seemed to largely have to do with a natural or inborn talent. As if God had created a certain person to do a certain work and gave him the ability to do it. But wise men began to examine these things to try and find if there was some reason or some cause that made such men effective at what they did. Because if we could discern specific things that made these men effective, and we could learn to do those things or to imitate those things, and we could gain a similar effectiveness, we could not only acquire that skill ourselves, but we could also teach it to others, and it would be a true art. After all, an art is a skill that can be learned. An art is a skill that can be learned. An art is some skill that can be understood in a scientific way, studied and practiced, so that a man can obtain that skill even if he's not innately gifted in it. He can gain it through study. And we call that art. So the wise men throughout history analyzed those activities at which some men were extraordinarily talented. And in many, or even most activities, they were able to establish a science or a systematic knowledge of the elements or principles of that skill. And once that science had been successfully established, once that skill had been effectively investigated and the science established, it could then be considered an art that could be studied and learned by practice. And this is what we mean by arts and sciences. Many activities cannot be classified as arts. If we see a man who is 7'6" tall dunk a basketball, we can say that that ability to dunk a basketball when a man is 7'6" tall is a natural gift. But if there was a man who was only 6 feet tall, who could figure out how the body works, how the body jumps, and what causes one man to jump extraordinarily high, he could figure out the science of jumping. He could practice the art of jumping, and he could equal the feet of a man 1.5 feet taller than him by the art of jumping. Because it's possible by study and practice to increase one's jumping ability and thereby to equal an extraordinary achievement by someone gifted with great height. And this is true in many different skills. So for example, if we were to revisit that great priest who was an excellent speaker, we could break down his speaking ability. If the carpenter asked, "How can I speak like this priest?" we could break down the speaking ability of the priest into its rhetorical elements. We could also break down the speech into its logical elements, and we could also break it down into grammatical elements. And we would find that 3 different arts are actually at work in this priest's speech. We could learn to imitate some things by the study of the art of rhetoric, but not everything in the priest's speech could be learned in this way. Another art would be necessary to understand how he prepared and presented his arguments, those persuasive, moving arguments that he used in his homily. And we would find that these are not learned through the art or science of rhetoric, but these require a different investigation, the knowledge of the science of reasoning. And we could break down the arguments of the priest into their logical elements, and we could learn how he does what he does and why it seems effective by studying the elements and principles of reasoning. And likewise, as for his vocabulary, his pronunciation, the way he articulates his words and speaks, we could study the art of grammar to learn how to speak correctly. And so this man's speech, through analysis, through investigation, could be broken down according to its rhetorical, logical, and grammatical elements. Now, when we consider that this has been the interest of men for 6,000 or 7,000 years now, we should expect that much of this work has already been completed. The most important, the most influential skills in human life have surely been investigated, analyzed, systematized, and presented to us as arts. And that's what we find when we look at the classical liberal arts. We find a set of studies, sciences, as it were, which present to us all of the elements of different subjects or different skills, which have been discovered and arranged into systems by wise men of the past, and have been given to us that we may study them, practice them, and make effective use of them in the most efficient way possible. So even though I was born a son of a construction worker with parents that had no formal education, I'm able in just a few years to learn multiple languages and the arts of reasoning and speaking through the classical liberal arts, thanks to the work, through the generosity, through the benevolence of wise men who lived before me, who, instead of simply making use of their own intellectual powers for their own personal benefit, chose instead to serve the common good and produce sciences and arts that would benefit future generations. Cicero once told the story of a man who was 95 years old. I believe he tells this story right at the beginning of his treatise on old age. But Cicero told the story of a man who was 95 or so years old, and he was seen working as hard as he could to plant apple trees or some kind of fruit tree. And the men who saw this man working to plant these trees observed that he was 95 years old, and it would be 20 years or so before these trees would ever even bear any fruit. And it was commented, it was said about this old man, he sows seeds or he plants trees that will profit another generation. And in that man's work, we have a model of the spirit of a philosopher or wise man who lives not for his own personal profit in this brief life, but is willing to undertake projects that won't benefit him personally at all, but will offer some good, some fruit to a generation to come. And we find in the works of the great philosophers many such trees, as it were. Works that they slaved over for decades, knowing that they themselves would never use. And we inherit these things not conscious of the difficulty by which they were produced. Just take a day and flip through the Summa Theologica. And then imagine Thomas Aquinas starting that work with blank sheets of paper. And just try to imagine the toil, the hours, the personal sacrifice that were required to organize and produce even a portion of the Summa Theologica. And then learn that St. Thomas died at the age of 49. And we see not just a smart man, not just a gifted man, but a man who sacrificed for our benefit, to leave us something to help us. And we underestimate these gifts that wise men of the past left to us because we're not careful to think about the choices that they made in their own lives, even though many of these wise men had access to kings, to riches, to fame and power, but chose instead to withdraw from society and devote themselves to valuable works and compositions that required them to labor incredibly, often at the cost of years and years of their lives. We inherit these things today, as I said, 6,000 or so years into human history. And these works that have been composed, covering the most important and influential skills in human life, are the subjects and studies of the classical liberal arts curriculum. Grammar, reasoning, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy. These are the 7 liberal arts. 7 most influential skills as regards the benefit of the soul of man. The classical Catholic curriculum begins with these 7 arts. And when we gain some skill in the use of these 7 arts, we can then use these skills to investigate other subjects. These are the tools of investigation, the 7 liberal arts. They're the tools of philosophical investigation. So once we've learned those 7 liberal arts, we can then look up at the heavens and say, how do the heavens work? What are the heavens? What are these objects we see in the sky? What is the sun? How does the sun move? Why does the sun move? What is the moon? What is the function of the moon? We can ask these questions, and by the help of the 7 liberal arts, we can investigate those questions and find answers. But again, being 6,000 or 7,000 years into world history, into human history, we can be sure that men have already done this work. Wise men have already undertaken this investigation by means of these arts, and they've done the work to systematize the knowledge and leave for us organized sciences in many different fields of study concerning many different subjects. And so if we want to understand, for example, the natural world, we don't need to start as if we're Adam waking up on the second day of creation trying to figure out what's going on. We can sit with Aristotle's work on natural philosophy and in a few pages receive into our souls knowledge that took years and years of painstaking philosophical investigation. And we can become wise efficiently, thanks to the generous labor of Aristotle. And if we want to know about the heavens, we can study Aristotle's work on the heavens and see what he was able to know in a scientific way about the heavens based on the principles of natural philosophy by means of the 7 liberal arts. And if we want to know about plants, we can study Theophrastus's History of Plants, which he left to us after he investigated plants by means of the 7 liberal arts. We can study the work of Ptolemy's Almagest, where, based on the principles of reasoning and arithmetic and geometry, he investigated the heavenly bodies and explains to us their form and their movements. As I said, in the art of astronomy. And all of these different subjects can be investigated by means of the 7 liberal arts, and then we move on into all of the different sciences that have been investigated and arranged for us so that we can know the causes of these things, to understand the elements and principles of these things. And this is the purpose, this is the goal of the study of the classical Catholic curriculum. The curriculum starts with the study of grammar, and this is common sense. Remember, the way that we learn is by moving from wholes to parts, because the novice knows of wholes by observation, but the expert knows of parts by analysis. Another way that this was explained by the wise men is that in the beginning, we learn about things as they are known to us, to creatures who learn by means of our senses. But when we think of trees, or of men, or of stars, or seas, or mountains, or angels, or demons, or heaven itself, we think of them with human thoughts. God says to us, "My thoughts are not your thoughts," in the sacred scripture. And we think of these things with human, ignorant thoughts based on the senses of our bodies. But this is only the beginning of learning. God himself, who is a spirit, understands these things in a way that differs from our perception. He says in the Old Testament, the Lord does not see as men see. And the goal of philosophy is to learn to understand things not as they are known to us, as sensible bodily creatures, but the goal is to study to understand things as they are known to God. And we do this not by means of observation, but by means of reasoning, by philosophical investigation. We move from wholes to parts. We move from perception by means of the senses and ignorant observations about what is visible or what is audible or what can be felt or tasted. And we move to a more expert knowledge of the elements of things as they are known to God, as they truly exist in their true nature. We learn the true nature of things when we analyze them and know them according to their elements, to the principles of which the wholes are composed. Now, this learning is circular. It's circular. As I said, we begin with ignorant observations of the wholes by means of the senses, and then we analyze the wholes and investigate them by means of reason. And this is analysis. And we break them down into their elements, learn of the elements. And when we know of the elements, we know of the principles and the causes of anything. We then know that thing as God knows it, if our knowledge is true. But after we've come to this knowledge of the elements of a thing, we then work to reassemble it. We reassemble it. And we once again observe it as a whole, but with the knowledge of its parts. And we arrive back at the beginning, seeing the whole, perceiving the whole, but understanding its parts. And this is why true learning is circular or cyclical. And this is why, when we look at the classical Catholic curriculum, it appears that we start and end in the same place. This is why there's no simple ascent through the classical liberal arts. It's not a simple first grade, second grade, third grade ascent through artificial grade levels. The modern grade level system is completely artificial. It's not true learning. It's not wisdom. In the classical liberal arts, just to illustrate and explain this, we begin with the study of grammar. A young child, let's say 7 or 8 years old, begins simply memorizing the lessons of his grammar. He learns to read. He learns to look at a word, to look at a letter, to name the letter, and then to identify the sound represented by the letter. He then learns to put letters together, speak their sounds in succession, and form words or syllables. He then learns that the spoken words that he knows, spoken words that he uses every day, that he's learned by simple imitation, by literally memorizing and repeating names of things and expressions that he's heard from others. He begins to learn how those words, those spoken words, are actually represented in writing. He learns how they're spelled. He can then look at a word in print and recognize that that written word represents a spoken word that he already knows and uses every day. And he can begin to communicate not only in spoken language, but also in written language. Once he becomes able to communicate in written language, once he is able to read efficiently, he's now capable of studying any of the arts, or at least reading the texts. And so once he's become literate, he is able to begin reading, let's say, the art of arithmetic. He's able to begin memorizing the elements, note the word elements, of geometry. And so he's able to begin almost any of the arts and sciences once he becomes literate. If he has teachers who are able to lead him orally, again, he is able to understand and begin studying any of the arts or sciences. He simply needs a teacher to help him with vocabulary, because names are unfamiliar and concepts are unfamiliar, and that's the whole point of learning. And so he can begin to make his way through the different arts and sciences once he's become literate with the help of a teacher or with the help of a dictionary. But as he gets started in any of the arts and sciences, he continues his study of grammar, moving from simple knowledge of words and sounds into the principles of etymology, where he learns the forms and functions of different words in sentences. And then he moves into syntax, where he learns the rules for constructing sentences to express complete ideas in spoken and written language. And when he progresses in syntax, he becomes capable of composing, of expressing his own observations and ideas and his own will in both spoken and written language. And his knowledge of grammar increases while his knowledge of other arts and sciences increase. And there is a certain natural and real order in the classical liberal arts and in all learning. Not like the artificial order of a modern school program, but a real and natural order. He would find, however, that if he were to take up the study of geometry, before he had made some progress, not complete mastery, but some progress in the art of arithmetic, that he would not be able to understand the concepts spoken of in geometry, because they are dependent on the concepts learned in arithmetic. Again, he would not need to master the entire art of arithmetic to begin geometry, but there would be a certain point at which his knowledge of arithmetic would prepare him to begin the study of geometry. Now, while he's progressing in these different arts and sciences, his knowledge and learning begin to shed light on his studies in earlier arts and sciences. For example, as a young child, he may memorize the parts of speech in grammar, and yet not really understand the significance of that lesson. or why it's necessary. But when he gets into the art of reasoning and studies Aristotle's categories and Aristotle's work on interpretation, the boy is going to understand that the art of grammar was actually developed after the art of reasoning. Because the art of reasoning shed light on the art of thinking and speaking. The rules that he learns in his grammar textbook were discovered by the men who had mastered the art of reasoning, who then went back and produced a science of speaking and writing, so that the art of grammar served the art of reasoning. And the art that's studied first actually was produced last, because the art of grammar could never be comprehended truly until the art of reasoning and the art of rhetoric were first understood and systematized. And so we find a very complex circular relationship between all of the arts and sciences. And the study of these arts and sciences is the work of philosophy. True philosophy, not fake modern school philosophy, but real philosophy, the pursuit of true wisdom. We find that there is a simple ascent, a simple natural order of studies, and this is common sense. It's easy to understand that a child must learn to read before he can learn to read an arithmetic textbook. It's obvious that a child must learn to construct sentences before he can construct speeches. The art of grammar must be studied before the art of reasoning and before the art of rhetoric. But at the same time, the study of the art of reasoning enlightens the study of the art of grammar. The study of arithmetic prepares one for the study of geometry, but the study of geometry enlightens the study of arithmetic. There's a circular or cyclical or reciprocal, is what Aristotle actually says, a reciprocal relationship between the arts. The simple progression of studies that one who's familiar with modern education might desire is not going to be found in the classical liberal arts curriculum or in the classical Catholic curriculum, which includes the philosophical and theological sciences, because these studies are more complete than any modern artificial curriculum. The relationship is cyclical, more complex than artificial modern school subjects. And so if you're looking for a modern, quote-unquote, scope and sequence, you're never going to find it in the classical liberal arts curriculum, because the classical liberal arts curriculum is far too complex to offer any artificial, simple scope and sequence. The reason you can get a nice, simple scope and sequence in a modern school is because the curriculum itself is artificial, the content is minimal, and the achievement is very, very basic. So look for that same artificial, not true, but artificial simplicity in the classical liberal arts curriculum is to ignore the reality of what the classical liberal arts curriculum is. There's no way for children, for example, parents will also ask me, how much time will my child need to study this curriculum? And that's simply an inappropriate question. It's like me saying, how much time will I need to earn a living? How much time will I need to successfully create a new business? How much time will it take me? No one asks a question like that. And it just reveals the sort of disrespect and low expectation that comes with modern education, as if this is some kind of optional activity that we can just cut a portion of our day and say, yeah, I can afford, 1 or 2 hours, but I'm busy. I've got important stuff to do. This learning is the most important stuff to do. And if you don't have wisdom, where are you rushing to in all of your other activities? Sacred Scripture says, wisdom is the principal thing. Therefore, get wisdom. Scripture says that wisdom is more precious than all silver and gold. Nothing you can desire compares with her. God Himself says that to us. So imagine the ignorance that's revealed when a parent asks, how much time will it take to study this curriculum? My answer is always, it takes all of our time. It takes all of our time. There's nothing else even to be compared with the benefits available from these studies. They take all of our time. And if you're not interested in wisdom, if you've just got other things that you want to run around and do without wisdom, you might as well go and do them. And if you're not interested in wisdom and all you're looking for are some secular diplomas or certificates, well, there's already systems in place for that in all of the modern schools. So, if you're concerned about how much time there is, or how much time this curriculum takes, you're revealing that you have no actual interest in what this curriculum is about. And you might as well go back to your modern school and be content with what's there, because that's where such a person belongs. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we're concerned with the pursuit of wisdom. The right question is not, how much time will this take me? As if the curriculum is interrupting one's life. The real question is, how much time can I give to this curriculum, and how can I justify giving my time to anything else? Especially when we're talking about the education of children. We're under no obligations to earn money or pay for their expenses in life. That's why Youth is the time for extraordinary toil, as Plato said. Youth is the time for progress in the classical liberal arts, so that hopefully, when the child reaches adulthood, his mind is already in possession of wisdom that's necessary for him to make the most important decisions of his life, which are made as he enters adulthood. Wisdom should be in the soul, ready for those decisions, rather than left for after those decisions, which is itself foolishness. The reason why, when we look back through history, we see so many young men and women who were under the influence of the classical liberal arts and classical philosophy and Catholic theology, choosing to devote their lives to religious vocations, was because they had already been introduced to wisdom as children. And that wisdom was in their soul and ready when the time came for them to make the most important decisions of their lives. And they made those decisions not by how they felt or some kind of mysterious, wishy-washy feeling about vocation. They didn't walk around talking about discerning a vocation and all this modern nonsense. They made those decisions in light of true wisdom, based on objective facts, objective truths. For example, St. Teresa of Avila knew objectively that religious life was superior to secular life, and therefore she chose religious life. Not because of any sense of a calling, not after any kind of discerning. She made that judgment based on objective wisdom. The Church tells us that celibacy for the kingdom of God is superior, is more excellent than marriage. And reason would tell us that if we have the opportunity to choose celibacy for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, rather than marriage, that would be in our best interest. It's a more excellent state of life. St. Paul acknowledged that different gifts were given to different people, but he also commanded Christians to desire the more excellent gifts, to pray for those graces, not to simply pretend that whatever graces I'm dealt with at birth are the only ones that I can get. But if there is a knowledge of something that's to be pursued in life, we should pursue the graces necessary for that life, praying and asking God for them and trusting that God will, in fact, give them to us. And this is not only for religious vocations, but for any wise or noble cause in life. David was not by birth capable of killing Goliath. St. Peter by birth was not competent to lead the church. None of us are competent natively for the work and opportunities that God gives us. God always challenges us and overwhelms us to test us, just like when Jesus asked Andrew how they would feed the crowd of 5,000 people. He said, the scripture says that Jesus asked him that knowing what he would do, already knew what he was going to do, but asked the question just to test Andrew. If you're asked to do something that's greater than your own native strength, how do you respond? Do you excuse yourself because of your native weakness? Or do you pray and place your faith in God and offer yourself like the boy with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish and leave the rest to the grace of God? St. Paul complained that he suffered with some kind of what appeared to be physical problems, and he prayed that God would take them away from him so that he could go about the work of his ministry, which was physically grueling. And God said, no, my grace is sufficient for you. But how can kids even make these decisions in life when they're given a modern education and not even given an introduction, to wisdom? No taste for the contemplative life by parents who are themselves worried and troubled about many worldly things, all of which will be taken from them. So when we come to the classical liberal arts, we can't look for some silly, artificial, modern scope and sequence. Is there order in the classical liberal arts curriculum? Absolutely. But you've got to first understand what the classical liberal arts curriculum is, at what end it aims, and how it works. There is a simple common sense assent, for sure, that begins in the study of grammar and works up through the liberal arts. But at the same time, each lesson enlightens the previous lessons, because the art was created by men who had mastered the sciences themselves. The arts are the result of reverse engineering, if you're familiar with that concept. And so yes, there is an order for the beginner. But as soon as he begins to make progress, he looks back on his former lessons with an expertise, with an insight that he didn't have the first time, and he understands it more fully. That's why when we give children memory work and everyone in modern society throws their hands up and complains, what they're complaining about is that they're too lazy and impatient to seek true learning. They want everything to be made easy, and they want all achievement, all gratification to be immediate. Whereas the classical liberal arts curriculum and the method of study employed by wise men is one that's aimed at mastery and one that is patient. Yes, a child is asked to memorize definitions that he doesn't understand. But the reason why is because, unlike a modern school program, the lesson that he's learning today is going to be explained tomorrow. And he's going to take the lesson he learns tomorrow and go back to what he memorized the days before. And his previous lessons, when he reviews them, are going to be enlightened by his later lessons. Whereas the modern school will simply cut off all memorization because it can't be understood at the time of memorization. But that's irrational. It's lazy and impatient. And true learning is for people who are interested in true learning. In our generation, there are not many people interested in true learning. Rather, what I find in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy is that parents come in looking for an excuse go back to the modern curriculum so that they can pretend that it's necessary for them to be there. They're just looking for an excuse to settle for the modern curriculum. But their excuses are false. So when you look at the classical liberal arts curriculum, use some common sense. It's obvious that we must study letters and sounds and basic grammar before we can begin reading any books on any subject, and that's why grammar is first. It's obvious that we must learn the art of reasoning before we can compose speeches that are persuasive, and therefore reasoning comes before rhetoric. However, once we learn the basics of the syllogism, it's sufficient for us to get started in the study of the art of rhetoric. And as we begin studying the art of rhetoric, and we begin learning the art of rhetoric, it's helpful for us to be studying literature where we can see examples of what we study in rhetoric. And that's the point of studying literature, is to look for examples of the principles we learn in grammar, logic, rhetoric, and all of our other studies. And as we study literature, that study enlightens our prior studies in the classical liberal arts, and as we continue studying the classical liberal arts, they continue to add more understanding and insight into the other subjects we study, and it's a constant cycle, constant circle. So I hope that that's a helpful explanation of the order of the curriculum in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. If you're stressed out because you're trying to figure out how to pack this into a modern school calendar, you can just forget about that. It's not going to work. But the bigger question you should be asking is, why are you trying to do that? Why are you trying to fit 64 crayons into an 8 crayon box? Why? Why are you doing that? No one requires that of you. There's no one requiring that your children only study when the public schools are in session. So why are you pretending that you're under some kind of stress? If you're concerned about a homeschool evaluator, do you think that a homeschool evaluator is coming to make sure you're not studying too much? Or do you think that he's coming to make sure you're not studying too little? Are you going to pretend that studying more than the public school is going to get you in trouble? Is that what you're pretending? That the evaluator is going to be upset that you study year-round with your children and study more complex subjects than are available in the public school? Is that what you're pretending? Well, if you are, then stop pretending. You're responsible as a Catholic parent to give your child a true Catholic education. The modern K-12 curriculum has never, ever been used to give children a true Catholic education. If you want to give your children a true Catholic education, all the saints that you tell your children about, if you want to actually imitate them, if you want your children to actually enjoy the benefits of the knowledge that they were given when they were in school, then stop pretending that it's necessary to raise your kids at home like public school kids and give them a classical Catholic education. This isn't science. This is very simple. This is common sense. If the saints studied and taught a certain course of study and recommended that study to everyone they ever taught or influenced, how can any Catholics justify ignoring that course of study and settling for something that wasn't even designed to serve as Catholic education? How can Catholic parents justify that choice? Fulfill your duties to your children and give them a true Catholic education. The order of the classical liberal arts curriculum is so simple that it can be understood by common sense, but it can't be made so artificially simple that it resembles a modern school scope and sequence. The only reason a modern school can provide a scope and sequence is because so little is actually studied and done in the school. And even if you get that scope and sequence and it looks impressive on paper, you have no idea where your kids actually are in that scope and sequence, or if it's even being covered in the classes. No one knows. No one knows. No one knows what your child's grades mean. No one knows what the content of your child's quizzes and tests are. No one knows. So don't pretend that the modern school offers something that it clearly does not offer. The same is true of Catholic schools and Catholic homeschools. To sit there and say, oh well, this program is accredited. What does that have to do with a homeschool? Accreditation isn't even for homeschooling. Accreditation is not required by any colleges, so you're just in a big circle of confused, irrational arguments. You're justifying a modern education because you say you're concerned about college, and yet the colleges are not even telling you to give your children an education in an accredited school. You're making that up. But you're pretending that the college is making you do it, and that's not even true. You're choosing an easy route that fails to serve the ends of Catholic education. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, you can look at our curriculum and see that everything is covered. Everything is covered. The reason why parents don't like it is simple, because it goes far beyond the lazy, short-sighted, worldly, modern curriculum. That's the real reason why parents struggle with it, why parents are averse to it. And instead of just saying so, they try to make excuses for why the public school curriculum is better, as ridiculous as that may sound. If you don't care, I know that there's nothing that I can say to change your mind, and yet, if you've listened through this talk, you're probably not the kind of person who doesn't care. Maybe you have more to learn, but that's not a bad thing, is it? Help is available for you. I'm happy to answer questions and help you understand everything that needs to be understood. But don't make irrational excuses. Your child has one shot at a quality education in life. One shot. And parents can choose to give them the best opportunity possible or to shortchange them. Don't shortchange the next generation of Catholic students. Give them a classical Catholic education, the education taught and studied by the saints and wise men all throughout history. God bless.